This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised. Welcome back to Coronial, everyone. I'm Georgie.
I'm Emma.
And I'm Alice.
And today I'm going to be discussing a death that was subjected by the coroner to a non-publication order, which protects the identities of those involved. Therefore, I've used the name Lee as a pseudonym for the individual who died in order to assist with the delivery of the story. However, their true identity is not known, nor is it to be published.
Did you use this pseudonym, or was that used throughout the...
I used the pseudonym.
Yeah.
It was the inquest into the death of ABC.
Okay.
I decided to name them Lee
Okay.
as a very gender neutral name of someone of that era. Of note, this episode will include information about ending one's own life and may not be suitable for all listeners. So if this episode isn't for you, we will have you tune in for the next one. Lee and their spouse were married for many years and were elderly. Lee's spouse had unfortunately been diagnosed with a terminal illness for which they elected to self-administer a substance to voluntarily end their life under Queensland's Voluntary Assisted Dying legislation.
I was about to ask, legally or illegally?
Legally.
Mm-hmm.
And from now on, I may refer to this as VAD, Voluntary Assisted Dying.
Okay.
Lee was nominated as the contact person for their spouse during this process. This made Lee responsible for informing the coordinating practitioner when their spouse died, returning any unused VAD substance, and if asked, provide information to the VAD review board. And so just for a little bit of context, the Voluntary Assisted Dying legislation is relatively new in Australia. It has existed in international jurisdictions for a period of time, depending on where you are, or it may not exist at all in some jurisdictions as well.
Except in Australia, there was that brief period in, 1996, where it was legal in the NT?
Only in the NT.
Yeah.
So yeah, the legislation is relatively new. On 29th of December 2017, Victoria became the first state to pass legislation allowing voluntary assisted dying, state not territory, which commenced in practice in June 2019. VAD legislation was effective in Queensland from the 1st of January 2023.
Okay, that is very recent. Are they then the only two jurisdictions where it's legal currently?
No, so it started in Victoria and basically every other state has either enacted or is in the process of enacting their own voluntary assisted dying legislation.
Right.
So I think basically every single state now has it or is in the process. And so when I talked about Lee having to be or maybe asked as the contact person to provide information to the review board, I think that's just in the context that it's very new. And that's why I don't think that would necessarily be for everyone on every occasion, and especially as things progress.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept as well, of having that sort of support person or report person almost required in the process, because that puts a lot of pressure on that person. And, for some people, they might not have that support person who'd be willing to take on that role.
I couldn't get out of what I read whether that's necessary or whether
that was a choice in
an elective
circumstance.
option.
Or could you have someone like a social worker
be
that
contact
person? Because
I'm
obviously
not
the
sure.
drugs, unused drugs need to get returned. That makes sense. There needs to be
a way
a person
that needs to be controlled in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't entirely sure. But in this instance, Lee was the contact person.
Mm-hmm.
In Queensland, to be eligible for voluntary assisted dying, the person must be diagnosed with a disease, illness or medical condition that is advanced, progressive and will cause death, is expected to cause death within 12 months and is causing suffering to that person considers to be intolerable. They must have the decision-making capacity in relation to voluntary assisted dying. And so this rules out things like dementia, where ultimately by the time that you are likely to die within the subsequent 12 months, you no longer have that decision-making capacity.
Yep.
You must be acting voluntarily and without coercion. You must be at least 18 years of age. You have to be an Australian citizen permanent resident or have been ordinarily residing in Australia for at least 3 years before making the first request.
Right, so there's no voluntary assisted dying tourism allowed in
So
Australia.
additionally, you also then have to have been a Queensland resident for 12 months. So again, when these were coming into effect, because Victoria was the first state to enact it, you then would have had to have moved to Victoria
12 months prior.
But then also you have to have been terminally ill, likely to die within 12 months. So it also kind of essentially rules out that tourism concept of moving to where it's available.
Yep.
Once a patient is deemed eligible for voluntary assisted dying, a specific pharmacy is required to prepare the VAD substance due to how dangerous it is. The VAD substance is then personally delivered by a health professional to the patient, no matter where they reside in Queensland.
A health professional?
Yep. So I think in this instance it was a nurse that delivered it to them.
I was just about to say, can doctors legally deliver that?
Yes.
Oh, they can?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's not against the Hippocratic Oath?
No.
Okay.
I mean, that's a really hard one to define because I think some doctors do think that, and you can have
it's an ethical
conscientious objection.
Yeah.
But in terms of, so this particular case deals with self-administered voluntary assisted dying substance.
Yeah.
But there are also in-hospital deaths where it is in fact administered to the patient who can't administer it to themselves after they've already requested it. They've already got all of the permissions to do it. But then, you know, maybe they can't swallow or they can't administer it to themselves because of various reasons.
Yep.
And doctors are protected under certain protections included in this act so that they are not committing murder.
Yep.
But they have to have done a whole bunch of things to get to that point to be able to do that and to be able to administer it. So it's not on a whim kind of requirement.
You have to actively be involved in that program or
and there's extra training and there's lots of checks and balances,
which kind of then mitigates that, you know, ethical situation because you've taken those steps to
get
become qualified or whatever it is to be that, then you obviously you know, are less concerned.
That step has to be there though to make sure that person's not committing murder by the criminal code. So like there's lots of intricacies around that and in hospital administration, which we're not going to be dealing with as much.
That also means that if you do object to it as a doctor, you just then wouldn't do the extra training.
Yeah.
That means you could.
And there's only like a very small number of doctors in the state that do it anyway. Like as in it's not a common thing. It's like there's a one state service. As I said, there's one pharmacy that's delivering it. There's one service that is going to places to provide the service rather than there being multiple services across the state.
Yeah, gotcha.
So yeah, there's also a very limited number of people involved in this service at this current point in time.
Yep.
As far as I'm aware, as far as I could tell from the reading I did. So once the VAD substance had been delivered to Lee's spouse, it was their right to self-administer it at any time and place that they felt suitable.
Is there an expiry on the substance?
It wasn't mentioned, but it said it can be used at a future time, which I'll get into later, basically a future within the subsequent 12 months.
Okay.
So along with being provided the substance, the pair were also provided with an instruction manual that described information on how to keep the substance in a safe place and also how to prepare the substance for use at the time that they wanted to use it in a 17-page booklet.
Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that was a lot of pages.
It makes sense that you would need to have detailed instructions because you don't want people making it up.
Yeah.
But that's still a lot of pages to read.
And look, I want to hope that it's an A5 or smaller booklet. Like,
yes.
I want to hope these are small pages, not 17 A4 pages. But
yeah, and maybe there's some legal stuff they need to put in there.
And maybe it's lots of pictures.
Yeah,
Let's
possibly.
hope it's lots of pictures.
Yeah.
After receiving the VAD substance, the couple became infected with COVID and were hospitalised.
Oh, no.
Lee recovered from COVID and was discharged from hospital within a couple of days. Unfortunately, Lee's spouse continued to deteriorate.
I feel like I know where this is going now.
Yes. Due to their deteriorating health, they elected to continue with their voluntary assisted death within the hospital setting. This resulted in a VAD substance being provided to Lee's spouse by a health practitioner within the hospital.
Yeah.
And so this is a different substance because it's going to be administered differently because it's no longer the self-administered option.
Okay.
And ultimately caused them to pass away on the 8th of May 2023. And so, again, another VAD team member had to travel out to the hospital that the spouse was in and administer that substance to the spouse. On the 16th of May 2023, Lee was found unresponsive at their residence in Queensland. Nearby was an empty VAD kit, and this was the kit that had been originally prescribed to Lee's spouse.
So Lee did not return those unused drugs as they were supposed to?
Lee did not.
No.
The pathologist who provided a cause of death reportedly died due to VAD substance toxicity. During the inquest, the coroner was not concerned with when or what caused Lee's death. This was not in contention, but rather how to prevent persons being in possession of a VAD substance when they are not the intended user.
Yeah. Which is hard because, again, part of the process of requesting it is that you have another person
exactly
with you.
But why did they administer it in hospital without requiring return of the original
before they administered? Yeah.
But that's really hard because how do you be like, I won't do what you have requested that you have the autonomy and right to request until someone else does something for us because you are in hospital unable to do it yourself.
Yep.
And so it was actually then reliant on the contact person.
Yep.
So I can also see why that isn't required.
Yeah.
Because the argument is like, well, what if they never go get it because they're not ready for you to die?
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's also that the whole fact that it's in the sort of process that the contact person needs to return any unused makes me think that there would be circumstances in other cases where it is self-administered at home and there is still some left over. Whether or not there would be enough left over to cause death
depends
we'll come to that.
This form of the substance is as well.
And I suspect the way that it's done is that you are mixing up all of it and you are administering all of it. And so there shouldn't be leftover.
Yeah.
And so I think it's written into the legislation for exactly these purposes where, well, because I mean, you know, these people are getting given it and they are suspected to have an illness that's going to cause their death within 12 months. But, you know, tomorrow they could walk out and get hit by a bus.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's just written into the provision that there is the chance that it might not be used or that they actually ultimately die of their illness before they have the chance to take it, to use it.
That's true.
And so I think it's not necessarily that there's going to be an unused leftover from having made it up. I think it's just that they're accounting for situations where it may not end up being used.
Yeah, and that's very much a foreseeable situation.
Yeah,
that would happen. Like, I could see, and because of the nature of the substance, they would absolutely have to write something in about that. Like,
they
what
need
happens
it back.
is that they need it back. Exactly. You can't just have these lethal substances
sitting
out
around
in the community.
Yeah,
that are left unchecked.
Absolutely. So the inquest sought to investigate whether health professionals appropriately sought return of the unused VAD substance and the safety of the VAD substance prescriptions, including if the currently mandated VAD procedures adequately minimise the unauthorised use of the VAD substance. At the time of Lee's death, the VAD legislation had only been in place for 107 days. The inquest findings stated that, and I quote here, any state-sanctioned euthanasia program can only have one measurable objective. This is precisely 100% compliance and that no innocent or unintended persons is in any way harmed. And so the coroner also went on to state, and I quote, the Parliament passed Oral Substance Administration Law, which, in my respectful observation, did not have any appropriate balance struck between patient autonomy and lethal medication safety. And so this is me premising this discussion to give you some insight into how the coroner felt about the issues discussed in the inquest. Because I think that the coroner was very biased in terms of their dislike of this legislation and that may have had some impact on the way that they've written their inquest findings. And it's not that I inherently disagree with anything that they've said. It's just that so much of it was in that negative light that I can see that maybe there's some personal biases here.
And I feel like this topic is not black and white. It's mainly grey. And I mean, these are all hypotheticals, right? But this person, so Lee has obviously just suffered, is elderly, has suffered a traumatic loss of their partner.
Yeah.
they obviously foresaw this happening. Their partner was unwell. Yep. They'd applied for this VAD. But who's to say that even if this was administered at home, then Lee wouldn't have done something similar? Obviously, they wouldn't have had this facility to do it, but was planning to do something similar anyway. So it's like, yes, I understand that this having access to this medication was a facility for them to be able to do it, but it doesn't mean the outcome was necessarily any different than what it would have been otherwise.
And the coroner absolutely found that the use of the VAD substance was preventable.
Yes.
Lee's death?
Yes.
Unclear.
Yeah.
Because there was potentially suicidal intent irrespective of the VAD substance.
Exactly. Yes. It was just, it happened to be the facility in which that means to an end happened. And yes, it made it more accessible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm also not saying that, this substance should be handed out willy-nilly. It does definitely need, strict regulatory control, as it sounds like it does. It's tricky though.
Yeah. And look, agreed. And so it doesn't ever come across like the coroner's not on board with the legislation itself in terms of, it's not like the coroner is saying that they don't
totally
agree with
anti-VAD.
Yeah. It's just that they don't agree with the way this legislation has been written because of the risks. And that's made very clear. And look, again, I agree. We all want this legislation to be as well written as it possibly can be so that we minimize the risks as much as we possibly can.
Yes.
So I get the premise there and the argument there, but I will be using a lot of quotes from some of the more interesting comments that the coroner provided. So with regard to the return of the unused substance, the VAD substance was initially delivered to Lee's spouse on the 24th of April, and then they ultimately passed around the 8th of May, so relatively short time frame.
Yep.
Once Lee's spouse had elected for the in-hospital death, Lee was informed that the VAD substance needed to be returned by the 10th of May, 2023, as per the regulations and legislation. Then additionally, on the day of Lee's spouse's death, Lee was also reminded about the need to return the unused substance, which, like, who wants to have that conversation with someone? I cannot imagine being like, so we're going to administer this one. Don't forget you've got to return that one. Like, that's just
hard
horrendous.
Because potentially Lee had sort of formulated this plan before his spouse received that substance in hospital.
True.
Or maybe it was only afterwards. Maybe it was only on the day that they took that substance that they decided, instead of returning this, I'm going to take.
Yeah, so it's both that reminder, but also just like how do you compassionately have that conversation when someone's losing their loved one?
Yeah.
Like, well, don't forget to do this.
Yeah.
And look, when people are dying in hospital, there's a large number of terrible conversations that have to happen.
Yeah.
But that one just seems particularly terrible. And I'm sure that they do it not regularly, but they're probably very, very well trained how to have decent conversations.
Yeah.
It sounds unpleasant to me. On the 10th of May, the VAD team attempted to contact Lee to discuss the substance return, but were unable to get in contact. Similarly, another attempt was made on the Friday, the 12th of May, but over the subsequent weekend and even the Monday, no further attempts were made to contact Lee. It was on the Tuesday that Lee was discovered to have used the VAD substance to end their life.
Right.
It was given, once it was determined that they were the spouse was going to die in hospital, they had a couple of reminders and then, given Lee some space and time, and then started to remind Lee again, at which point they were then having trouble contacting Lee, and then Lee had ultimately used it anyway.
Do we know, were they just contacting Lee by phone, or were they actually going over to their house?
It seems like by phone. There was also contact with some other family members, and again, this probably happened not in isolation with just Lee and Lee's spouse. Like, there were other family members around because they were losing.
Yeah, true.
Their own family member. But, Lee is the contact person. Lee is the person that is required to return it. And so that's the primary person that they have to contact. And so I also don't know about the regulations around, then branching out to other people and having other numbers, because presumably there's also privacy regulation there around who they can contact.
Well, that's right, because other people in the family may not have known that this was happening. Yeah.
But they also, they've got the contact person, someone to contact.
Correct.
The coroner was strongly of the opinion that 2 doses should not have been issued at the same time. The coroner also highlighted how emotional the contact person is likely to be, thereby limiting their ability to be able to return the VAD substance or even take in the information that they needed to return it in the first place.
I just think that's an interesting presumption to make. That someone's going to be, it almost sounds like the coroner's saying they're going to be too emotional to make that decision or to be able to facilitate that.
No, I think they're coming at it more from a like, that's just going to be a hard thing to ask of someone who's just lost their loved one.
And it's an extra administrative task that they need to do.
That's true. I mean, on top of, organising.
And it was only 8 days. It was 8 days between the death and Lee's death. So, like, they don't have a long period of time.
Yeah, that's true.
And then there were also limited steps that the health professionals could take to request the return whilst remaining compassionate and caring. Like, can you imagine badgering someone who's just lost their spouse and or loved one? Hey, don't forget to do that thing. Hey, you've still not done that thing. Could you do that thing? There's only so many times you can make that argument before it becomes less compassionate and caring. And that's really what your role is and what you want to be doing. And so it sucks that they have to then try and enforce this legislation because it's a legislative requirement. Furthermore, the coroner felt that the repeated attempts at discussing the return could act as a reminder, as you kind of brought up, Alice, to the fact that that contact person has this unused substance at their disposal, along with a step-by-step guide to a peaceful and certain death.
Yep.
In terms of regulation, the obligation to return the VAD substance falls solely on the contact person, who risks a $33,000 fine if they do not return the VAD substance.
Which is not really a problem if you're planning on using it yourself.
Yeah, and who's going to try and prosecute that?
Yeah.
I mean, unless you used it inappropriately for someone else. But
yeah, true. Yeah, if you used it to murder someone else.
But that's a different problem. There's also no requirement to return any previously prescribed VAD substance intended for self-administration before the in-hospital dose is given. And the coroner was pretty astounded by this. The coroner was not on board with the fact that you can have 2 prescribed to the one person.
Yeah, that I understand.
Yeah, and I sort of would have thought that the prescription of them would be tracked, so that I'm just thinking if there's some sort of system they're using to keep track of who has what, that there would be like a flag in the system to say, hey, this person's already been prescribed this at home and maybe you can't prescribe it again.
For all SA medications, I thought that there is now like a, you must look it up because the same like with the drugs of abuse that like you've got to check that someone hasn't already been prescribed it. But again, in this instance, they're in a hospital, they don't have access to it, and it's probably seen as pretty not compassionate to be like, you can't have this because you've already got one at home.
Yeah.
You know, like
it's not very compassionate to the person who
is dying, who has no option to go get it themselves.
Yeah.
They're reliant on someone else.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the coroner found that there was no breach of protocol or legislative processes by any of the health professionals involved in the care of Lee's spouse. However, the coroner was of the opinion that the VAD substance should not have been provided until right before its use, that original prescription for home, thus aiming to prevent dual prescription, and then may have had the impact on the possibility of Lee ending their life.
But see, that's really hard because you apply for this substance, it gets approved, and say, even if you said to them, I'm nominating this date as the date I'm going to take the substance, things can change. Yeah. And you can change your mind that, okay, I don't actually want to do it today. I want to do it in 5 days' time.
Absolutely.
Or I want to have one last, I don't know, weekend with my family or something like that. So just only giving it to them just before they're going to use it. Well, then how do you enforce them using it
on that day
within that time frame?
You cannot enforce someone using it.
No,
you cannot. That is murder.
Yes.
Well, yeah, exactly.
That's the troubling bit, right?
Great in theory, but in practice, I don't think you can give it to them the day before they're going to use it because.
And this is where I think the coroner's biases come into play. Where I'm like, they were adamant that things needed to be different in order to make it safer, but I was like, but I don't think you're understanding the realities of how practically you could actually implement these things. Queensland Health performed a review following Lee's death, and in the recommendation that was made as a result of that review, there was plans to tighten the existing procedures for the recovery of unused VAD substances, but no further detail was provided in the inquest findings as to how that might be happening.
Yep.
And this is only newly released in 2024, so I think it's probably just like, it's still happening.
And maybe they're going to introduce a home visit point of contact. So you call them, you've got unused substance, you need to bring it back in.
Yeah.
And then if they don't within a certain time frame, you actually go to their house and
then
have a face-to-face conversation.
Yeah.
And then they can hand it over to you. They don't have to drive anywhere to drop it off. It's maybe just a little bit easier. And that way you can almost do a welfare check.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. And it's one of those ones where it's like, well, yeah, if the health practitioner had to travel in order to administer it in hospital, why was that not part of the procedure of like, I administer this in hospital, but like I also have to go back with the other substance, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And like they already have the system in place where if you're doing it at home, it gets delivered to you.
Yeah.
So they know your address.
Yeah.
They have that capability to go to your address to drop it off.
It depends on how rural you are, I guess, though. Because if you're in like the absolute middle of nowhere, it may not be that easy.
Yeah.
You know, that might actually be like a week's worth of travel.
Yeah, true.
Processing in terms of how to get there. But
it could be, but I'm sure that's a remote circumstance as well.
Yes, true. Majority of the population live in urban areas.
Yeah.
So in terms of the safety of the VAD substance prescriptions, so essentially that's all we've talked about in terms of dual prescription. Now we're just looking at other safety concerns. So the coroner discussed a number of key safety concerns regarding the VAD processes, including that prescription process, how the contact person is decided and their responsibility for the VAD substance, and whether health practitioners should be present at the event of the self-administration rather than just the in-hospital deaths. So the VAD substance is classified as an S8 drug, which is the highest classification possible. Mm-hmm. This results in its prescription, dispensing, and administration being very tightly controlled. The VAD substance can only be prescribed following the agreement of 2 doctors, so people can't be permitted to undergo voluntary assisted dying unless at least 2 doctors agree. The substance is then only dispensed by 1 single pharmacy in the state and under very strict controls, and then it's hand-delivered by the VAD staff. So picked up from the pharmacy by the staff, taken to the patient. For in-hospital administration, the substance is stored securely in a locked safe. 2 nursing staff are required to be present to remove the substance from the safe. Stock levels within this safe are regularly audited, typically every 8 hours at the end of each shift. And strict handling requirements are required prior to direct administration of the substance to the patient to reduce the risk of diversion or misuse. So like once it's out of the safe, you've got to have eyes on it at all times, and then you've got to give it to the patient, and then you've got to see that be administered to that patient.
Is that the same with all like Section 8 drugs?
Yes.
Apart from this particular one?
Yes, that is the same for all S8 drugs within a hospital.
Within a hospital, but obviously
not within a community.
Yeah. And are there circumstances where Schedule 8 drugs go out into the community other than this particular?
Yes. Schedule 8 are any drugs of dependence or of high risk. So all of your opioids are Schedule 8. All of your benzodiazepines are Schedule 8. Anything that's going to cause significant harms or be at risk of really heavy dependence.
Do you know whether all hospitals carry the VAD substance?
No. So it'd only end up in a hospital once the pharmacist has prescribed it and a VAD practitioner is giving it. So that's an example of all S8 drugs of how they're going to be handled in a hospital. But yeah, obviously this one, like it's only even going to end up there
if there's a patient who has been has requested and been approved for it, and it's going to happen.
And it's going to happen with the health practitioner from the VAD team, because they're the only ones who can bring it to that hospital anyway.
Okay, cool.
Right. Yeah. And then I assume, there's not a health practitioner in every, hospital in Queensland.
Just sitting around.
So it's not as though it's,
So it doesn't happen like that. Like it takes time.
And that also then means that drug is not sitting around in the safe.
Hospital.
Yeah.
Which other people in the hospital would have access to.
No, not at all. For the self-administration substance, it's provided for future use, as I mentioned, up to 12 months in advance to the patient, plus minus their contact person. I think it, in theory, is directly to the patient, but presumably the contact person may be there.
Yep.
No screening of the contact person is performed, and no further health authority or professional body oversight occurs once it's been given to that person. Patients are advised to store it securely in the lockbox provided with it, but where it's kept and how secure this location is after it's left with the patient is their responsibility.
I've got a question. So it's obviously the intent of this is for self-administration of this substance.
Yep.
Is there anything restricting the support person from actually administering it?
Yes, because that would be murder.
But, I mean, no.
They can help prepare it.
Okay.
But you have to be able to administer it yourself, or otherwise you have to request the other in-hospital administration.
Right. But, like, theoretically, there's no one there policing it when it's actually happening.
No.
That is accurate. But, like, so the doctors won't prescribe it if you have, say, Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, so you can't physically.
Which means you literally can't get it in your mouth without spilling it everywhere.
Yeah, they would say you'd have to go for the in-hospital administration for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, however, like, if you had a nasogastric tube or whatever, that you could still, like, get it, administer it to you. So, basically, in Lee's spouse case, they weren't able to swallow properly anymore.
Right.
So, that's what changed to the in-hospital administration. So, yeah, my next point was about to be no one else can administer the substance to the person. No, that's right. Because unauthorized administration would be murder.
Yeah, I really, like, in reality, I wonder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, how much?
I suspect the contact person is given a fair talking to around that.
I'm sure they are. But...
Because if you get caught, that's murder.
Yeah.
Correct.
And so it depends, weighing up. And it's
the
hard.
risk you're willing to assume.
Yeah. And so, as I said, in hospital, you're given the appropriate medical professionals are given special protections.
Yep. Of course, yeah.
The coroner stated that the self-administration policies are completely at odds with every safe handling and secure storage approach that would apply for the same substance within a hospital. The coroner further noted the highly dangerous substance could simply be left on the kitchen table of the patient's residence if they so choose to.
But that's exactly the same as all other Schedule 8 drugs.
Correct.
But all other Schedule 8 drugs don't cause immediate death.
It could if you took way too many of them.
Yeah, but you can say that about any drug, right?
But that's like any of them.
Yeah.
And look, when I say don't cause immediate death, I mean, if it's a child, it could.
Yeah.
And there are a number of other drugs that a single tablet could cause death in a child.
Mm.
But I think what the coroner is trying to emphasize here is that, like, you can't even, like, it's in a locked safe that requires two people to get to it if it's in a hospital. And sure, that, okay, if it's your standard pain medication, that's the same.
Yep.
But this one has such a different definitive purpose.
And yeah, I guess that's what it comes.
You shouldn't be letting it just sit around on your kitchen table.
Yeah, I guess there's a difference between a medication that can be abused or could be used to end a life and a substance which its sole purpose is to end a life. Yeah.
Yeah. It was also noted by the coroner that the quantity of the VAD substance provided is the same dosage to all individuals. So this could increase the danger as a residual dose could be used for a secondary individual, such as in a couple's pact by the sale of the substance or during inappropriate administration without an individual's knowledge.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking of when we're talking about returning the unused amount.
Yeah.
And like they have all of the details of the person who's requested it. So to me, it should be pretty easy for them to be, well, depending on how the substance is formulated, to be able to give them a dose based on that person's
size and body weight. Yeah. And so I don't know enough about it to know that, but it sounds like, no, they just administer one single option. But that if, you're a particular body size or whatever, like it'll cover everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, you're not going to be administering too much.
Well, yes.
The result is going to be the same either way. So
there's no such thing as an
they may as well.
But you can administer too little.
Yes.
And that's problematic.
Yes.
And so that's the, like, what if you then, like, couples pact, but then it's not enough for each of you.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's really dangerous. And so, like, that's why so much legislation needs to be put in place, right? So, yeah, it's a very challenging topic. The coroner was also concerned about the VAD substance being issued for future use. So the coroner felt that a substance should be held by the pharmacy pending request for actual administration. So in your context of not knowing what day, blah, 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 that like, well, there's no reason why the pharmacist can't have it prepared, have it sitting there, having it in their locked area, etc. And then you calling the pharmacy and or the VAD service when you're anticipating it's going to be within the next week. Which again, then that's still not like defining a single day, but it's not at some point in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
That is
which is a lot, like is a huge difference. The coroner found that this approach would not be unreasonable, stating, and I quote, We are talking about an end-of-life program, a very significant decision which requires appropriate checks and balances and time. It's not a fast food delivery.
Look, I don't think anyone's saying that.
And I was like,
I do not need that much paperwork to get fast food delivered to my house.
I was like, that's a very
strong
different
statement.
Yeah, very different thing.
Yeah.
Very different intent. Anyway, thought that was a good comment. An interesting comparison. The coroner therefore found the VAD procedures for self-administration were inadequate for ensuring medication safety and prevention of deliberate misuse. At the inquest, steps that had been taken by the VAD service since Lee's death were discussed. A senior administrator for the VAD service stated that daily reports of how many VAD kits were issued were now produced for real-time monitoring of VAD substances in the community. The coroner was pretty scathing of this remark, stating that this in no way constituted real-time monitoring and that, I quote, perhaps persons in authority should avoid using what they think is catchy terminology unless the term actually applied. It's like,
that's
wow.
harsh.
You are not enjoying this inquest. Additionally, it was identified that the report was only updated after each death had been reported to the VAD service, which usually occurred after it had been recorded to births, deaths, and marriages. A process that's known to take weeks to complete.
Yeah, right. So this isn't like the day after the contact person gets on the phone to the VAD service and says, hey, this is...
No, this daily report did nothing to identify precisely where the substance is, how it's been kept, if it had been consumed, if the person had died yet.
Yeah, right.
It was just like these are all the prescriptions we've made.
Yeah, I can see how that is a daily report, but not a useful daily report.
Not at all. Not for the process the coroner's actually asking about.
Yeah.
So in terms of the contact person, a contact person is nominated by the individual requesting the voluntary assisted death. The contact person needs to state that they're over the age of 18 and needs to provide their name and contact details. They don't need to prove that they're over 18.
I was about to say, so no ID checks or anything?
The coroner highlighted, and I quote, that a person is required to undergo greater identity checks to enter a nightclub in Brisbane than to become a contact person.
I mean, yeah, that is actually a fair comparison.
Accurate.
Yes, yeah. So it was identified that the VAD service felt conducting background checks for contact persons were too intrusive on the person's privacy, and therefore no criminal history or mental health checks were conducted.
Well, see,
nor were an individual's ID even checked.
I'm okay with them not getting the criminal convictions because that's irrelevant.
It's not irrelevant.
Well,
It's
not irrelevant.
If
but
I like to traffic drugs, would you like to have me be the holder of a substance that
what if
only objective is to kill someone?
But what if the person that you're supporting is your elderly parent and they have no one else?
I might be immoral enough to take that away from them.
Yeah, I mean, true. You would think at least ID.
I do see merit in having some sort of background check.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For me, it was the mental health check. Because again, we've talked about couples packs and the fact that the couples might want to go together or that the person might be so overcome with grief. The coroner found the situation very troubling, that an individual can so easily become responsible for a substance which has just one objective, to end life, and that situations for its potential misuse are readily imagined.
Yeah.
In this case, Lee had a history of depression and had previously been medicated for the issue. This information was not known by the VAD team when assessing Lee as a suitable contact person.
Yeah, I suppose if they're using the term assessing them as a suitable contact person.
Yeah, they don't really
that
assess
implies
them.
there is some assessment to begin with.
True.
And can you just switch to, instead of having a support person who's the contact person, can they all be social workers? Or like some sort of VAD staff?
Yeah, but then what's the point of the contact
true.
person is to like be nearby, be like, hey, is that person still going okay? Well, like the social worker's not going to know.
Yeah, and I guess then the contact person is meant to be the one there with them where they take the substance, so therefore the social worker would have to be there.
Yeah.
Maybe people don't want to have essentially a stranger
nearby.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so again, it's a very tricky point because, again, I can see arguments both sides.
Yep.
But I do think knowing the information isn't harmful. Like, I don't see the harm in knowing it. They're stating, yeah, it's, you know, not particularly good for the privacy of that contact person, but
it's their medical records, their criminal record. Like, it's not public information, but it's not private information either. And they're not doing anything with the information.
Exactly.
That's the whole thing about a privacy. Yeah. Is that you can...
It's confidential information. Yes, it is taken confidentially by that
It
service.
is. This is tricky because I do understand both sides of the argument because they're not the patient.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they really don't need to be giving any information or background information about themselves because they're not the ones who are seeking medical care in any way. They're just there supporting. Like, you don't ask that information of people who are standing bedside with someone in the same circumstance. So why should you hear? But it's also not the same.
They're ultimately becoming responsible for a very dangerous substance.
Correct. So I also understand, like, I wouldn't want to be giving such a dangerous substance to someone and they are physically handing it to this person as the contact person who has a history of mental health issues.
And it's not to say that there's not someone else in the household that, you know, they've not disclosed lives with them that has the criminal history or has the mental health disorder.
That's
so,
true.
like, I think it's hard because there's so many variables there.
It is, but I think, and this is probably bringing my own personal biases into it, talking about biases, I think it is such a valuable program.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, I think it's an important option for people to be able to have access to this in a setting where they're comfortable.
Absolutely.
And make, you know, that end of life process as comfortable and as...
And if you don't want it to be in a hospital or a hospice.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you want it to be surrounded by your family rather
that's
than
what
a
I was
health
trying to get at. Like, make
Yeah.
that end of life process as good for everyone involved as possible. And most of the time that is not in a hospital. It is at home where everyone is comfortable and everyone feels safe.
Yeah.
So I think it's an important option that people can have, but I can also see it's fraught with, it's a regulatory nightmare.
Absolutely. And that's probably why it hasn't existed for a very long time.
Yeah, because it's towing, it's
so
one of the
hard.
it's towing the line in terms of ethics like no other thing really does, to be honest.
Absolutely. The coroner felt no considered thought had been given to the possibility that the contact person proposed could be someone with a criminal history that may have ulterior motives for the substance, or someone with a mental health concern who may not be suitable for the control of such substance. Additionally, the coroner was concerned about how affected by grief the contact person is likely to be when they are required to return the VAD substance, further emphasising the need to ensure the contact person can appropriately handle the responsibility without further risks or harms. And again, I think that's a really hard thing to define because the way that you are pre someone dying to the way you might be post, you might have stood there saying to the VAD team, I got this, I'll take care of it.
And you may feel like you are able to.
Yeah, you know, with the absolute conviction that is what you'll do. And then, you know, the person passes away and that might change dramatically.
Correct. Yeah.
And so I don't know how you could suitably assess someone. But I guess you just need to, I think more information about that contact person would be helpful, or a couple of contact people so that you've got a team.
Like a fallback.
But again, that's also depending on the person who's actually dying.
Correct. They might not have a couple of people. They might not want a couple of people. They might just want their one support person and that's it.
Yeah.
They might not want to let anyone else know but this one person that they trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So.
And it's also... having multiple support people is this is a lot to take on for any one person. Having then multiple people,
and then if the multiple support people disagree about something.
True. Yeah, I've never found it fun when you've got the more people you add.
Yeah, exactly. The more opinions
it gets.
You get, and
So finally, the coroner discussed whether a health practitioner should be present at the death of someone who self-administers the VAD substance. So currently the regulations and the legislation favours a patient's autonomy to choose where and when they die. However, at the inquest, the VAD service reported that there have been cases of near misses following self-administration of the VAD substance, such as incorrect administration, which had not resulted in a calm and swift death as expected. The coroner felt strongly that the process required increased health practitioner oversight due to the risks of uncertainties or inappropriate outcomes. The coroner provided a number of concerns that could be improved with direct practitioner oversight at a patient's time of VAD self-administration. So not saying that they aren't self-administering or that it isn't in the place and time that it happens, but just saying that a health practitioner should be there. And this could include things such as assisting with the preparation of the substance. Remember, the instruction booklet was 17 pages long.
Yep.
Confirming the death of the patient if there was any uncertainty. Yeah. So they would be there present and an appropriately trained individual to confirm that.
Yep.
Assisting with the certification of death and providing information about appropriate services to call following a patient's death. I would have assumed that they would have been informed about this information.
You would have thought.
Maybe that's a few pages of the booklet as well.
Potentially.
Is what to do afterwards.
After death. The health practitioner could also encourage them to ensure the location is appropriate for where the person chooses to die.
Yeah.
This could reduce the risk of the patient choosing locations where others may be at risk of happening upon the death of another individual.
Yeah, so like maybe don't do it
garden.
out in in a public park or something.
Exactly. So the coroner gave examples of things like maybe your favourite park happens to be next to the children's playground, and you're not in the right mind to realise that could put those children at risk.
Not appropriate.
Yeah. Or someone who's alone, so therefore like they're in a public place but no one's like calling to, get the death certified because they've got no one with them.
No one knows what's happening.
Yeah.
Which is again why I'd hope if you didn't have a contact person or a support person, they would either say you can't self-administer or there would be a social worker assigned to...
Or there would be a very clear date and time and that, a service needs to come to my house to certify my death at 10 a.m. on Wednesday. Please and thank you.
Yep.
Oh. Because realistically, if that's what you want, I don't think that that's unreasonable.
No, it's not.
And that,
but you
that would be much better for me than in hospital.
Yes, but you can't be inside your house with everything locked.
Yeah.
And then not tell anyone when it's going to happen because then.
Finally, if a health practitioner were present, additional administration of supplementary medicines could be provided in the instance that the death is not swift as expected. So presumably they could be coming prepared. But I think that's like preparing for the worst to happen, and like ideally you don't want that to be an outcome anyway. It's nice having a backup plan, but reality is that you don't actually want that. And so I don't think that should be a good argument for having the health practitioner there.
Yeah.
Because you want to be making sure it's happening irrespective.
But is that a good argument for at least having someone else there? Can you imagine if you were doing this alone and then something goes wrong?
True.
But even still, just because you have someone there doesn't mean they're going to be
what's that person meant to do?
Or emotionally capable enough to...
Yeah, I know.
They can call someone.
I know.
But what if they panic and think that then their responsibility is to make sure your life ends?
And then they administer more.
Well, no, or they're committing murder by...
Yeah, correct.
Assisting you in another way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that whole argument again, like we can offer that compassion to a dog, but we can't to humans.
That is absolutely it. That's why I'm so in favour of this because...
Oh, me too. I'm 100%.
We can give that compassionate, calm end of life to an animal, but
not to
previously
ourselves.
We weren't able to do it to her.
Palliative care tries to, but I think there's still so much of that. And I don't think stigma is the right word, but that concept of like you want to hold out forever.
Yeah.
That is less permissible in humans than it is in animals.
Yes, and I think it's because as a society, generally we're afraid of death. We don't talk about
correct.
it. So, of course, we're going to be like, no, you don't ever want to die. Like we all apparently want to be immortal. Yeah. And so people aren't willing to talk about how shit it is at the end.
And the insufferable symptoms that you go through.
Always fascinated me because I'm like, you do know that we're all going to die.
Yes.
Like, you know it's an experience we're all going to have. Most likely on both ends, i.e. we're going to experience someone else dying.
Yes.
Likely in our but we all are going to die. That's a given. So like I just don't understand why it's not discussed more. And I think there's an inherent, this is going way off topic, but I think people view death as being undignified. But it's not.
Well, it doesn't need to be.
It doesn't need to be. And this is a way to have it dignified.
Well, I was going to say, and I think that undignified death is because we hold out for so long not wanting to happen that it becomes undignified.
Yep.
And then when you see people actively dying, it is confronting.
Absolutely.
It is very, very confronting. And yes.
It's not like they make it look in the movies.
No, it's not peaceful.
Yeah.
People are in pain.
Yep.
Well, but this is the thing. This
they
sounds
don't have
like
to
it really
be.
could be peaceful.
Correct.
Yep.
Depending on where you get to, but yeah.
And again, and I think, people who are maybe opposed to this maybe haven't had that experience where they've watched someone go through that.
I also wonder, though, whether the people that are opposed to this are because they're so worried about these uncertainties and these risks of misuse rather than they're, like, being opposed to the voluntary assisted dying specifically. Like, is it just their concerns about...
But again, it's that risk and benefit. And yes, I know this is a very, very high end, the highest end of those sort of analyses, because it is literally talking about the death of people and that is the end outcome. But...
yeah, true. I guess there'd be a lot of people out there be like, nah, it's still murder. You know?
You're still taking a life.
Yeah. And this one also, like, there's so many other caveats, sort of like you can't have any cognitive illness and all that kind of stuff that I really struggle with, because if I had dementia, I would like to be able to say when I get to this level, I would like, but you can't yet. We haven't currently got there.
You can't preemptively request this. No. It has to be done
at the time
contemporaneously.
Because you might change your mind. And I'm like, there is nothing in my life that is going to make me want to change that mind. But...
and it's hard because you can give do not resuscitate orders.
Yeah.
Yeah, at any time in your life, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
You have autonomy to give it at any point.
Which is a similar thing. Not the same, but a similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can sign DNR. So if you can sign a DNR, how is this that much?
I guess because signing a DNR just means if something happened, I don't want you to resuscitate me.
Yeah.
Whereas this is a very active.
It's a very, direct, it is
process.
Going to result in death.
Yeah.
I guess a DNR could result in death.
If you're in a position where you are at risk of death.
Yes.
Because, like, you could be a perfectly healthy 20-year-old just walking around, have a DNR, which is...
yeah, typically it's generally in a context of a specific
generally 20-year-olds don't just sign DNRs.
But they could.
Yeah, true.
They could. Theoretically, you could.
It's more of a proactive... yeah, I don't know. It can be there and not ever be used, whereas a voluntary assisted dying substance, you are going to use it.
Yeah.
The coroner felt the VAD substance should remain under the direct control of an authorised health professional and proposed the delivery of the VAD substance only occur once the patient has made the decision as to where and when they wish to administer the substance. With this scenario, the health professional would attend with the substance and is available to oversee or assist with its correct preparation, but then would be able to take a back step or remove themselves when the substance is actually being self-administered by the patient.
Okay.
That's not the worst idea.
It's not the worst, but I see it from the other side where I don't think that's good for the health professional.
Yeah, that's fair.
Because I think prescription and it being somewhat removed from your, like, participation and visually being exposed to that patient actually helps. I think that doesn't take into account the harms that could cause to the health practitioner.
Yeah, see, I kind of disagree with that. Working as a vet and doing euthanasia on animals, obviously animals are different to humans, I understand that. But people would often be like, oh, isn't euthanasia the worst part of your job? No.
I think it's different in humans, again, because of what we discussed before around it's not as common for you to be as accepting of death in humans. And I think that it ultimately possibly would take a toll because, like, I think, I've never worked in palliative care, but I could see, like, you would feel good about being able to give someone a dignified death, but that there might be an element that eventually you start to get a little bit worn down about I am causing people's death. And whether that would take its toll and therefore mean your ability to continue practicing in that area would be a shorter time frame.
I think it just really depends on the individual because I don't know, the way I saw it was always that it was almost a gift that I was able to do that. Like I was able to end suffering
Yeah, and look, I've certainly spoken...
Like, obviously was causing the death of a living being, but it was in the context of this being the right choice.
Yeah. And I've definitely spoken to health practitioners where, you know, people ask them, oh, you know, isn't your job stressful? Don't you, you know, get really over the stress? And they're like, no, I like having... I take a great reward in having the ability to help others.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think there is that element, but I guess I don't think the coroner's argument has taken that into enough consideration about health practitioners still having a right to have some separation there.
Yes, and how many extra staff would the VAD service need
for that
to be able to provide that?
True.
But again, I think that comes, like we were discussing before, like the own moral compass and ethical considerations of an individual. So if they're comfortable
with it,
then I don't see an issue with that option. But yes, it would probably narrow down the pool even more than what it is currently.
Yeah.
But
I suppose if that's the requirement, then you go into it full well knowing that.
Exactly. Well. It's not like you're forced
to do it.
To do this at all. So
true.
If people are comfortable with that, then I don't see an issue with it.
Okay. Finally, I just wanted to provide a small detail about the reporting of the cause of death, which I found really interesting. As part of the VAD legislation, those who die as a result of the VAD self-administration are recorded to have died due to their underlying illness or medical condition. And no reference to VAD is to be included on the death certificate.
And I think that's interesting because in some ways that's good because it means they still have their privacy about how they died. And the reason they're getting this substance is because they're going to die from that illness.
Yeah.
So if they didn't take the substance, eventually that would be their cause of death anyway.
Yeah.
But then I also see how that could be difficult from a reporting point of view.
Inaccurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that as we want people to have a dignified death, I think that it should be appropriate
You're
to
right.
report
It's almost adding to the taboo of it all, right?
a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would quite like that it is known because I think that is important that it's saying we allowed this person who, and so that you're dual recording like both that they use a substance as a result of the fact that they were going to die of this illness, so that there is that information. But I agree that there might be privacy issues. People might not want that included. I suspect from a legislation perspective, it's related to insurances and the risk of insurance denying a claim similar to like suicidality claims.
That makes sense.
They don't, and so I think that's why it's prohibited from being included. But I think that that's a little bit, disrespectful on patients' autonomy to choose that option. In Lee's case, ultimately he wasn't actually a VAD patient, and so they were able to disclose that on the death certificate because his death was due to toxicity, not as a result of a terminal illness.
Yep.
The coroner also disagreed with the Act's requirement not to report VAD substance use on a death certificate.
Interesting.
The coroner did not make any formal recommendations, but rather stated at the conclusion of their inquest findings, and I quote, "I do hope that the government is wise enough to read and consider these reasons and then act appropriately and implement the required changes to the VAD substance administration system."
They're acting like this is such a straightforward... Like the way that they're like, you should you should follow these. You should be wise and follow what I'm recommending. It's not
as easy as you think.
It's not as easy as...
It's not as black and white as the coroner's. Yeah. And so that's what drew me into this case because it was like, here's a bunch of solutions. I'm like, it's not really though. It's a very complex, nuanced process that is new. I assume has also been sort of devised based on other states' regulations as well. So even though it's new in Queensland, like it has existed for longer in other states.
And also internationally as well.
Yeah. And so
what goes on there. It's been
years.
Switzerland. I think it's
decades.
had it for a very, very long time.
So thanks very much for that discussion.
Very interesting.
It really does just make you think about the ethics of this whole area. And I think, as we've said a few times, I think it's an important thing that needs to be discussed, but
it's hard.
It's hard because you can see both sides.
Yeah, I don't envy the people that are trying to make these legislation.
No, I don't envy them, but I appreciate them.
Yes, definitely.
Because it's important.
Yeah. And I hope that the contact people that are involved, like in Lee's case, get the appropriate support that they apparently may need in the wake of losing a loved one, so that we can prevent similar things happening in the future.
For sure.
Definitely.
All right.
Very much.
We will catch you again next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.